Richmond captured, April 3, 1865. In school, my teacher, Miss Egbert, left the room. Returning shortly, flushed and joyous, she called through the doorway, "Boys, Richmond's captured!" There were short exclamations of pleasure, hitching in the seats, giggles and smiles among the boys. We were too young for a demonstration before our teacher. She told us to go home at once and tell our mothers. That was an end to discipline. We rushed out with joyous shouts, yelling, "Richmond's captured!" And running to my mother, I told her the glorious news. Soon there was the greatest excitement in the streets. Extras were bellowed by hoarse-voiced fellows, as well as shrilly calls by the boys. Flags were run up or out from the windows, also festoons of red, white, and blue. The streets fairly flamed like a glorious sunrise saluting the stars. Flags of all sizes were on everything, as well as on men and horses. It was a perfect jubilee of flags. My mother made a red, white, and blue rosette to pin on my breast beside my Lincoln badge, which I generally wore. In the evening, the windows were illuminated with candles stuck with tin nippers to the sash. Next day, on returning to school, all was a joyful bustle. The teachers and the larger boys were at work hanging and draping the colors. As for the boys themselves, they looked like field marshals with medals and decorations. The pillars of the assembly room were swathed in bunting. Miss Bell's brother, a fine-looking fellow, with a skill for decorating, ornamented the blackboards with patriotic emblems and colored chalks. What a wonder he seemed to me. Saturday, April 15th, I was sitting with my mother at breakfast when my father came in with a paper. His face was colorless, and his eyes were full of tears. In a dazed manner and husky voice he said, "President Lincoln has been shot." My mother began to sob, while I sat overcome with their sorrow, with my heart like a stone. But while there was life, there was hope, and all that tense, hideous day we waited for the news. Boys shrieked out the latest extras, and a fresh horror to it was the hollow bellowing of the men with bundles of extras over their shoulders, with black borders, telling in advance the blow which the nation had received. My mother got some crepe and hung it on the window. She then put some crepe over the red, white, and blue ribbon which hung from my little medal. I went into the street and looked down the avenue, and my mother's black streamer was the only mourning in sight. How long after, I do not recall, but long enough to impress me with the delay and make my mother's very conspicuous, some of our neighbors began to drape their windows, and people twined crepe over their flags as they hung them at half-staff. Next day it became universal, and people tried to outdo one another with pictorial evidence of their grief. Black-bordered pictures of Lincoln appeared in the windows. The Germans made the greatest display. One lager beer saloon near 34th Street had a large white Temple of Liberty built on the curb, its 13 pillars draped in crepe, a bust of Lincoln inside of it, lighted with candles. The crowd surged round it with admiration. One girl in the crowd expressed her approval in these words, "It's the finest show in the whole 8th Avenue." On Monday, April 17th, when we assembled in school, the boys had black crepe tied over their Union rosettes. In the assembly room, the pillars had stripes of black over the Union colors, which were wound around them, and black was mingled with the flags of rejoicing. All the old rancor against Lincoln was forgotten. The name of Lincoln stood for Union. Now it seemed to unite all, at least on the surface. There was no more Old Abe. It was now Father Abraham. My father told us he saw a crowd beating a man. A policeman came up and asked what was the matter. He said he was glad Lincoln was killed, was the reply. "Give it to the—" said the policeman, and walked away. Another case, when a man on the Brooklyn ferry said he was glad Lincoln was killed, they threw him overboard, and he was drowned. Lincoln lay in state in the City Hall on April 25th. Why I was not taken to see him I cannot understand. I know my father went, but my mother did not. Nor did I see the funeral which passed through 34th Street. The memory of this loss has had its effect on me, for I have always given a child the chance to see historic events. As in parades, I put them in front of me, as I did a small boy when the 7th Regiment marched to the front in 1917 on the way to France. A Boyhood Reformation. Lying abed one morning when I was about 9 or 10 years old, I got to thinking of my past life, and came to the conclusion that I was a very idle and no good sort of boy, as I had been doing nothing but play and fight, and did little or no drawing. So I made a resolution that I would change all that. So I got up and started at once to reform. After school, instead of going out, I stayed in drawing soldiers, battle pieces, etc., which I kept up day after day. My mother noticed the change and sent me out on various excuses, until she weaned me of my morbid condition. Apprenticeship, 1870 to 1874. A friend of my father's was an enameler of jewelry, and got me an apprenticeship as a jewelry engraver for brothers Henry and Paul Siebert. I was given a graver and set to work cutting lines on a piece of flat brass. Boss Henry would call out, "Dig deep, Jimmy, dig deep!" As my fingers were unusually strong, I did so, and put my graver clear through the watch case, which pulled down the profit, at least on that particular job. At noon, the boss said, "Go down to the saloon and bring some beer." "No," I replied. "What?" he said in amazement, and the others stared. "Why?" he asked, after he caught his breath. "Because," I answered, "I belong to the Good Templars, Temperance Society, and don't carry beer." There was a silence when he growled out, "I was a damned fool like that myself once. I used to belong to the Good Templars." A dead silence followed, then drawing himself up, he sneered, "Would you mind going to a saloon and buying some sandwiches and pie?" "All right," I answered. He handed me the money, and I went off and bought the lunch. I never saw beer while I stayed there. It was tough work, and in a few days the ends of my fingers looked like drumsticks with clots of burned and calloused flesh. That was the summer of 1870, and the Franco-Prussian War was going on. Henry Siebert was pro-German, and Paul was pro-French. They would fight and abuse each other, and jump up, quivering with rage, as though they were going to stick each other with their gravers. But it ended there. Day by day the French defeats were proclaimed with joy in the papers, and the enthusiasm for the Germans was unbounded. To stand up for the French was to invite abuse, and of course I invited it by asserting my opinion in and out of season, which added to my disfavor with the boss. One day the boss began to abuse the Irish, saying that they were in the draft riots. I said, "The Dutch were in it too." Here I was wrong. The rank and file of the rioters were Irish, and true Americans. "Oh, go to hell," said my boss. "I don't allow any man to talk to me like that," I replied, and grabbing my vice, "I'm no Dutchman. I'll brain you." He blazed out, "I don't ask you to take anything from me. Get out." "I'm not ready to go yet," I replied, and went on with my work. I was afraid to go home, and sat it out. He must have been afraid of me, for I stayed on, and on Saturday night demanded my wages, $2, which he gave me. At this time another jeweler got him to take on his nephew, and the second Saturday night, with my $2, the boss gave me a note to give to my father. On my way home, stiff and tired, I stopped in front of the Herald Building, Broadway and Ann Street, and read the posted headline, "Battle of Sedan, Fall of Napoleon III." Heartsick at the fall of my hopes, I went home and handed the note to my father. He opened it and read, "Dear Mr. Kelly, I don't want James around anymore. I would advise you to put him at some business that requires less exertion. Henry Siebert." My father looked up and said quietly, "What are you going to do now?" "I am going down Monday morning and lick him," I replied. "How are you going to get down?" "Why, ride down, of course." "No, I won't give you the money. And after you walk down, you'll be so tired out, when you get there, he'll lick you." Art School. After some family discussion, it was decided that James would enroll in the Academy of Design and begin an earnest study of the subjects for which he was apparently naturally adapted. While studying at the Academy, James Kelly helped start the Art Students League, which was founded in May 1875, an organization that still exists today. Patrick Kelly felt that along with attending art classes, his son should also learn a more financially secure trade, and James was apprenticed in wood engraving with the firm Meter and Chubb. At that time, for artwork to appear in newspapers, artists made their drawings in full detail on woodblocks as a guide to the wood engravers. But after a few months, James grew restive as engraving other artists' designs did not appeal to him. Patrick Kelly then called on Mr. Meter, asking him about getting James some work at designing, as reports were against him as an engraver. Recognizing young talent, Meter suggested that James should try illustrating for the Harper Brothers publications. Harper's. My father called on the Harper Brothers Publishing House in 1873, and Mr. Charles Parsons, head of the art department, and asked them to take me on as an apprentice, to draw on wood for the engravers. He was first told that they never received apprentices, and as to my drawings, many boys had applied. Some had better drawings, some worse, so he would not encourage me. Still, this did not down me. I do not know what my father said to Mr. Parsons, but the result, I was to go down to work and apprenticed till I was 21. I was the first apprentice that Harper ever took. I entered the art department at Harper's and met Mr. Parsons. He looked me over and said, "Go over there and make a sketch of some of the gentlemen in the office," pointing to a desk in the far corner. I took my place and looked over my surroundings. In the room was Theodore R. Davis, their special artist during the Civil War, Robert Lewis, who had just returned from France, C.S. Reinhardt, and Edwin A. Abbey. The artists did not draw from models, but put their work directly on the wood, depending on their previous knowledge or old sketches. After about a year at Harper's, I became best of friends with Abbey. Whenever he got into trouble drawing a piece of anatomy or drapery, he would come over to my table and I would help him by posing. Among the distinguished men who dropped into the art department was Alfred R. Woad, the artist, who had been special artist for Frank Leslie's and Harper's Weekly during the Civil War, and followed the Army of the Potomac and sketched all the great battles. A fine type of Englishman, he had a blond, fresh complexion, flowing hair, and long reddish beard. Very humorous, but inclined to be sarcastic. Talked in a very low voice, and as he reached the point of his story, he brought it lower and lower, till his audience were bowed in fascination before him. Thomas Nast was the great feature of Harper's at that time, but he never lowered himself to come in the art department among the draftsmen. When he came to town, he did his business with the Harpers in their private offices. My first sketch I showed Mr. Parsons, who nodded approval and said, "Now take a picture and copy it." I took one and copied it line for line. "Very good," was Parsons' remark when I showed it to him. Taking it from me quickly, he said, "Go and draw it from memory." I did so, line for line. Walking over, I handed it to him. He compared the drawing with the original. Looking up sharply, he said, "Kelly, you have a good memory," and handed both back. The copy was remarkably close. All this was to try me out as a special artist, I suppose, if I was in a position where I could not sketch but memorize. One day in the art department, an erect, slim, well-groomed, military-looking gentleman walked in. Mr. Parsons greeted him as Mr. Homer. They sat down while Mr. Parsons looked over the drawings which he had brought and made some suggestions. The man was Winslow Homer, and no one could have been more kind to me when I was a boy just starting in art. One day I was sent by Mr. Parsons over to Homer's studio, as he needed a model for some illustration. He afterward showed me one of his sketches he made during the war, one on brown paper showing Grant, Lincoln, and Tad standing on a railroad platform. I asked him, "Did they pose for you?" "No. I would not think of asking such big men to pose for me," he said. This struck me as rather funny, as I thought he was as big as either of them. He then showed me a Zouave uniform which he got from a soldier who came back from the war. Homer took him in and traded him a new suit of clothes for his old uniform. As I was leaving, he said, "Now, if you ever want to paint, come to me, and I will teach you." Edwin A. Abbey was always a great admirer of Winslow Homer, and much interested in the unusual friendship Homer had shown me. He said one day, "Didn't Homer tell you he would teach you to paint?" "Yes," I replied. At the same time, Abbey presented me a fine box of oil colors and advised me to go down immediately and remind Homer of his promise. The next day I went down and knocked on Homer's studio door. He opened it partly, then, recognizing me, smiled and said, "How do you do?" I blurted out, "Mr. Homer, you said whenever I wanted to learn to paint, I was to come to you." "Yes," he said, still smiling, but continued to hold the doorknob. "Well, I've come," I said. "Oh, you have," he answered in a hearty laugh. "Walk in." Then, looking me over, he asked, "When do you want to begin?" "Oh, any time. Now," I anxiously replied. Looking around, he picked out a small stretcher about 18 inches high. Placing it on his easel, he took his clean palette and said, "This is the way to set it. You begin with white, placing a dab near his thumbhold, then with yellow ochre, then with red ochre, then with permanent blue, and then with raw sienna." As he finished, he whirled around, leveled his black eyes upon me, and said sharply, "Will you remember that?" "Yes," I promised. He then put some oil on the palette and, taking his brush, thinned out the sienna, saying, "You sketch it in with this," as he brushed in a small figure of a girl. Then, with a light touch of a flat brush which he rested with its own weight, he drew a streak of white, yellow, red, and blue to a common center with a few light flips of his brush. Homer blended them without puddling, which did not crush the minute granulations of the paint, and applied a light, deft, crisp touch to the canvas without the colors losing any of their original sparkle. Wheeling around, he again asked, "Do you understand that?" "Yes," I answered. "Will you ever forget it?" "No." Then turning, he repeated his strokes, and after every telling one would turn, fasten his black eyes on me, and repeat, "Do you understand that?" "Yes," I would answer. "Will you ever forget it?" "No," I promised, and never have. Then Homer added, "If you make a mistake in laying on your color, don't try to correct it, but take it off with a palette knife and paint it on fresh." Homer finished the little figure, a brilliant one in effect. Then, sitting back, he finally asked, "Will you ever forget what I have told you?" "No," I repeated with emphasis. "That's right," he answered as he got up, and I started to leave. Shaking hands, he said smilingly, "Don't forget what I have told you, and if you ever want anything more, come back and see me." I left and went back to school with my new box of oil colors and set up my easel and canvas and began to work on the model in class. The professor came around and, seeing my layout, said, "Kelly, your manner is very affected," and then walked on to the next student. After he left the room, the students started laughing and snickering. But Homer's hand, with its masterly strokes, were in my mind's eye, and his words, "Do you understand? Will you ever forget it?" were ringing in my ears, so I was deaf to their chaff. When the teacher returned, he stopped, looked over my shoulder at my work, and went away without uttering a word. Later, when the professor returned to make his rounds, he stood beside me and looked intently over my work. Then, in a voice loud enough to be heard by the whole class, said, "Kelly, if anyone should ever tell you to change the style of your work, Don't do it." My status in the classroom was quickly changed. Homer not only gave me the full run of his studio, but instructed me in some of the essentials. He taught me all I really know, and in a most unusual way. He made me spend a winter drawing nothing but old silk hats and derbies, and finally old shoes. All my colleagues thought I was connected with a haberdashery. Homer insisted that all that could be learned about drawing could be learned by drawing but old hats and shoes. During this time, my secret ambition was to paint a picture of the fight on Lake Erie, so vividly described in Commodore Perry's logbook. I used to make sketches with all the spare time at the office. To obtain help for the sketch, some 2 or 3 other lads my own age were pressed into service, and a method devised for the obtaining of the spray effects, cannon shot hitting water. To accomplish this, we took up a load of stones and rowed out on the Hudson, steering our little boat near the 55th Street dock where some vessels freighted with bricks were unloading. We threw stones at the deckhands and called them all the names we could think of. At last they got so mad they stopped work and pelted us with bricks, which fell all round us, which gave the effect I wanted, of flying spray from shot plunging in the water. One day Abby came to me and said he was going to leave Harper's because they would not give him $40 a week. He said he proposed to set up a studio and asked me to go with him. I jumped at the opportunity and was for leaving at once without consulting anybody. But he said I must get a release from Mr. Parsons, as I had arranged to stay with him until I was 21. I told Mr. Parsons my plan. He looked up kindly and, beaming on me through his spectacles, said, "Mr. Kelly, if you want to go with Abby, you will not be happy here." He then wrote out a release which he finished with this wish: "I hope your proposed arrangements will be to your mutual advantage." In the fall of 1874, the Kelly and Abby team left Harper Brothers and started their own design and engraving studio located at 35 Union Square. Unfortunately, the 2 young artists struggled to find enough work to support themselves, and their business venture was short-lived. In the spring of 1876, Kelly embarked on a series of successful illustrations for Scribner's Monthly and St. Nicholas, a magazine for children. Scribner's, 1876 to 1878. The firm of Charles Scribner's Sons consisted of J. Blair Scribner and his younger brother Charles. They occupied the ground floor of the building at 745 Broadway, their bookstore in front and offices to the rear. The whole place had a hospitable, bookish atmosphere, and it was a delight to explore among its treasures. It suggested a gentleman's library instead of an office. Alexander W. Drake was the art editor. On my first entrance, I was so overawed that I saw little except the beautiful check for $10, and was overcome by the good fortune of having my drawing accepted. One of my first sketches for Scribner's came from a story I heard from my composition class professor in the Academy of Design. How, when he was a farmer boy in Vermont, he used to plow up skulls of Hessians killed in the old August 16, 1777, battlefield of Bennington, occasionally finding one pierced by a bullet. I represented a young farmer who has just plowed up a skull. He has halted his team and is pointing to a bullet hole in the forehead to a couple of boys. I made quite a feature of the horses standing in the furrows. I took it to Mr. Drake, who accepted it, and told me he would give me $10 for it. As my sketch was drawn hastily without models and crayon, I said I would like to draw it over again from nature. "All right," said Drake, "you may do so, but remember, I will give you no more for it." I started to draw everything from nature. A friend posed for the young farmer. I drew the horses from a team of Andersons. Another chum posed for the 2 boys, the stone wall and backgrounds from bits now included in Riverside Park. I then went to my friend Dryer's farm in 71st Street and Broadway and made a study of his father's plow. After I had finished this, I reproduced my studies in an India ink drawing and took it down to Drake. He paid me $10, and I went off happy. Sometime in late June 1876, I received a proof of it engraved by Thomas Smithwick, with the message that the horses had made such an impression on editor and author, Mrs. Mary Mapes Dodge, that she sent me the manuscript of an article written by Charles Barnard called The Horse Hotel. It was a description of the then new 3rd Avenue car stables. I went over there and made careful studies of the horses and grooms. When I took in the finished drawings, Drake said nothing that I can recall, but sent me down to the editorial rooms of St. Nicholas magazine. I had never been there before and felt depressed, for try as I would, I could not make my sketches look like those other artists. To me, they looked queer. I sent them in and sat in the outer room anxiously waiting for the verdict. In a few moments, a distinguished, handsome-looking lady came out with my drawings in her hand. She looked round the room, inquiringly, evidently for an artist, but there was no one present but a sunburned boy. As I stood up, she hesitated, saying, "Are you Mr. Kelly?" "Yes, ma'am," I mumbled. She shook my hand warmly, but I was too confused to remember what she said. On publication of the drawings, she sent me the following letter. November 17th, 1876. Mr. Kelly, I cannot resist the temptation, now that the complete December St. Nicholas is before me, to send my hearty congratulations to you on your Horse Hotel picture. They are so very good that the people will have hard work at first to believe that they were produced in this country. Mary Mapes Dodge. One day, when I was sitting in Drake's outer office, Dr. John G. Holland, editor-in-chief of Scribner's magazine, came in and sat down and started to question me, asking about books, pictures, and my methods of study, as well as my ideas of how a magazine should be illustrated. As I recall the occasion, I was put through a civil service examination and responded readily without reserve, as he had my confidence. Finally, he stood up and said, "Mr. Kelly, hereafter we shall give you no more manuscripts to illustrate. You shall originate and select the subjects and the incidents you think best to illustrate, and select the authors to write them up." I do not recall my answer to this, as I was a gawky, overgrown boy, with a sunburned face from continual exposure to the riverfront and stockyards, and on close acquaintance was apt to converse in the vernacular. After that talk with Dr. Holland, I would go to him and suggest an idea. I remember suggesting that I had heard of a fellow out at Menlo Park, New Jersey, who had invented a talking machine, and added, "You talk into it, turn a crank, and it repeats what you have said." He told me he had never heard of it, but after questioning me, gave me an order to go out and get an article on it. The early inventions of Thomas Alva Edison were featured in a series of articles for Scribner's Monthly, with illustrations drawn by James Edward Kelly, and as a result, the artist and inventor became lifelong friends. Edison. Thomas Edison was 31 years of age, and I 22 when we first met at Menlo Park. At that time, New York was beginning to hear of him. A reporter from the New York Herald was detailed to report his doings and sayings. This was taken up by other papers, and in a short time the entire United States, and finally Europe, rang and echoed with the name and wonders of Edison's work. The editor of the Scientific American referred to him as "that young man in New Jersey who is making the path to the patent office hot with his footsteps." When the first fierce lights of publicity were focused on him, Edison showed no sign. Praise was showered upon him that would have turned the head of anyone but a superior genius, one capable of appreciating the great work he had already accomplished in relation to the much greater work he saw before him. I had met him after one of his long, concentrated vigils. He was unshaven and worn, yet was as cheerful and joyous as was his wont. He did not feel called upon to indulge in those temperamental tantrums to prove his claim to genius. With his staff, he appeared more of a comrade than a dictator. He was always ready to listen to the suggestions of the most minor subordinates, and if they impressed him favorably and proved successful, he always gave them credit. He was never assertive or opinionated, or broke into a conversation. He was not what I would call a conversationalist, but talked in nuggets. He responded to a good joke with almost boyish glee, but never tried to go one better. Edison was the friend and ideal of my youth, and many of the joys of those days are associated with him. Personally, he always seemed to look upon me as a boy, and never allowed me to grow up, and, as a tribute to my having been born in New York City, called me a New York Cockney. When Edison would meet me, he would put on a swagger and address me in the vaudeville New York vernacular. Kelly's artwork continued to be a leading feature of Scribner's Monthly and St. Nicholas magazines for several years. His drawings were notable for originality, vigorous action, strong accents, and powerful contrasts in black and white. So characteristic that an interested reader would know them by the style without looking for the signature, which was frequently omitted altogether. Kelly's style of drawing and engraving was radical at the time. He frequently fought with the old-time engravers who struggled to reproduce his drawings in accordance to his idea as to the way they should be engraved. In a 1908 letter to Kelly, engraver John W. Evans reminisced about Kelly's breakthrough style. "I often smile when I think of the strenuous debates you used to have with the engravers who, while they were willing to humor you to a certain degree in your ideas, still clung tenaciously to many of the old methods of wood engraving that had been handed down by the forefathers of the art. The roughshod manner in which you rode over the established rules and traditions of wood engraving was certainly startling, not to say shocking, to the sensibilities of the old-time engraver, and it is not surprising that these men tried to convince you of the error of your ways, and lead you into the path which, according to the rules of engraving, you should have humbly followed." In 1877, the 22-year-old James E. Kelly was credited with changing the centuries-old method of wood engraving. "The newspapers used to give me frequent notices, some with the highest praise as the founder of the new school of wood engraving, and others saying that my drawings were the worst published in any magazine. I never saw the former, as I was too shy to buy the papers. When one of the notices came out, my mother sent me out to buy a paper. We then were living in an old cottage on 54th Street between 9th and 10th Avenues, and I didn't have the nerve to go to a nearby news store, so sped on to the next one, then quailed at the door, and continued on to the next one. This was kept up until I reached a corner newsstand at 3rd Avenue and 48th Street, where I finally mustered up courage to go in and buy a paper. I then slunk home and finally mustered up more courage to read it. This now seems foolish and ridiculous, but is a fact. I heard that several of our neighbors had called me a penny artist. Later they showed me the newspaper notices, and I finally became used to them as the magazines came out every month. The Hartford Courant, with which Mark Twain was at that time associated, said, 'The boss artist is Kelly on Scribner's Monthly.' Shortly after this, I was asked by editor Charles Marvin to attend to some illustrations. He sent for me and gave me some manuscript to illustrate for Bryant and Gay's, a popular history of the United States, which Scribners were publishing. William Cullen Bryant, the poet, and Sidney Howard Gay were the editors. Gay had been assistant editor to Horace Greeley on the Tribune. The principal artists of the day, both figure and landscape, were employed on it, and the greatest engravers on wood and steel were employed to cut its illustrations, which made it a perfect treasure house of graphic art. When Marvin handed me the manuscript, I felt a new world open before me. At last, I was to do historical work. I then started in with vigor to rummage for historical material, so as to make my work true in every particular. I now felt my work was appreciated, as well as congenial, and I was stimulated to do my best.